It is my pleasure to welcome you to our program titled, Did the Exodus Happen? History, Memory, and Theology with Dr. Benjamin Sommer. I am Matthew Silverman, the director of the Haberman Institute, and I'm very excited to learn with Professor Sommer tonight as he explores the Exodus from Egypt, an event that shaped our tradition in so many ways and continues to be a foundational moment for our Jewish identity. I would like to thank Arnold and Mary Hammer for sponsoring this program in loving memory of Rabbi Ruvain Hammer, Zichrono Livracha. Rabbi Hammer was a great friend of the Foundation for Jewish Studies, which has since been renamed as the Haberman Institute. He presented more than 10 lectures for our community and served as an esteemed scholar in residence as well. He was also a distinguished rabbi and scholar throughout the greater Jewish community. He authored numerous books, some of which are on my own bookshelf, and taught generations of conservative rabbis as the founding director of the Jewish Theological Seminaries program in Israel. For those who are interested, we will include Rabbi Hammer's bibliography and a link to a lecture he previously gave at the Haberman Institute in our follow-up materials. Thank you also to Binet Israel Congregation of Rockville, Maryland for helping bring this event to our community. And now I would like to welcome Saul Levy, the chair of the Life Lecture Series at Binet Israel. He'll give us a few words. Hi, Saul.
Hi, Matt. Thank you so much for including us in the program this evening. It's good to see you again. For several years, our Life Lecture programs have been held jointly with the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. And tonight's lecture, as many of you know, was originally scheduled for last fall, but unfortunately it couldn't occur then. But we're very pleased to be able to hear Dr. Sommer this evening. Our special thanks to Arnie and Mary Hammer for sponsoring tonight's program as well, as well as those contributions from B'nai Israel members and others from the community. I'd like to call your attention to our next Life Lecture, which is part of our series, before we start this evening's, and that'll be on Sunday, March 20th at 7:30. Also be on Zoom, and it will be with Professor Laura Liebman from the University of Oregon. And the title of her program is Once We Were Slaves. It's a fascinating story, and I think you'll want to hear it. She wrote the book, and it's really quite an amazing story, and I think it's something we all should learn about. Following tonight's presentation, the professor will take questions from our Zoom audience, so please put your questions in the chat box, and they will be curated by Matt or myself, and then we'll ask the questions on your behalf as we go along with the program. So it's my pleasure to welcome Sandy Mendelsohn, a longtime board member of the Institute, and he will introduce our presenter this evening, Dr. Sommer. Sandy, good to see you again.
Yes, thanks, Saul, for your warm welcome. We're pleased to partner again with B'nai Israel. We've done it a number of times in the past, and it's always great. My name is Sandy Mendelsohn. I've been involved with the Haberman Institute for 2 decades as a board member, president, program committee chair, and most importantly, as an engaged learner in our community. Our mission is to provide high quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. Welcome to our hundreds of Zoom participants tonight from the Washington area and from around the world. I'm very excited about our future programs. Here are the next 3. This coming Sunday, Dr. Joshua Parshall, a historian of American Jewish culture focusing on the South, will discuss Southern Jews and Black civil rights. On Wednesday, March 2nd, Professor Jacques Berliner-Blau from Georgetown University will talk about Philip Roth's legacy as a Jewish writer. And on Wednesday, March 30th, Professor Charles King, also from Georgetown, will talk about Professor Franz Boas, a Jewish scientist and immigrant to New York in 1886, who developed the first concepts of human diversity, the beginnings of cultural anthropology, highly controversial in its day, and in many respects important today. This is a fascinating lecture, whether you think you're interested in the subject or not. I've heard this lecture elsewhere and strongly recommend it. There's much more on our schedule, including classes on a variety of topics. Please visit our website, habermaninstitute.org, to learn about all we offer. I'm honored to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Ben Sommer. Professor Sommer, sorry that we had to cancel in October, We express condolences for your loss, Zichrono Livracha. I'm glad we could reschedule this before Pesach because it's obviously a very important subject that we can discuss around our Seder table. In 2009, while browsing through the reviews of new books, I discovered rave reviews and prizes having been awarded to a slim volume with the provoking title, The Bodies of God and the World of Ancient Israel. I confess that having some familiarity with Maimonides, I was intrigued by this. Bodies of God? I looked up the author and found that he had just become professor of Bible and ancient Semitic languages at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Presumably, he'd be safe as a speaker for us. I called Rabbi Haberman right away, told him what I had learned. Up to that moment, the organization had had no program committee. Rabbi Haberman had made all the speaker decisions. He said, "So what are you waiting for, Sandy? Invite him not just for one evening, but for a whole weekend." So we did. Our capacity crowd soon learned that Dr. Sommer is unique in combining creative biblical scholarship and a deep engagement with classical texts in a variety of languages with a strong respect for our tradition. We have heard Professor Sommer a number of times since then and always enjoy his original thinking on subjects which we previously thought we had understood. And that book about the bodies of God is a fascinating book, very readable. Professor Sommer's more recent book, Revelation and Authority, Sinai in Jewish Scripture and Tradition, is equally stimulating and has also received prizes and great reviews. We look forward to Professor's next book project, a JPS commentary on the Book of Psalms. He's writing one volume and editing the 5-volume series. Perhaps he'll tell us when that will be out. Professor Sommer will answer questions periodically during the presentation, as you have heard, but please send the questions in using the Q&A button. Matt will then read them to our speaker. Now, Professor Sommer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sandy. And thank you to all of you. It is a great pleasure to be back at the Haberman Institute and to be back at Binet Israel, two institutions where I have taught on a number of occasions and have always enjoyed teaching a great deal. It's a particular honor, I can add, to be speaking in a lecture in memory of Harav Reuven Hammer, Zichrono Livracha, whom I did not know personally, but I think of as a colleague, of course, because of his long involvement in JTS, and especially at the JTS campus in Jerusalem, which is now known as Mechon Shechter. It's a particular, really a great honor for me to be speaking in his memory. Yehi Zichro Baruch. And I'd like to also add just thank you very much to the Institute and to B'nai Israel for your flexibility. As many of you know, we had to reschedule this when my father-in-law died in the fall. And obviously, I really appreciate the flexibility. That was extremely, extremely helpful. So let's turn to our topic for this evening. As Sandy mentioned, I'm going to be stopping a couple of times during the lecture. Probably in about 20 minutes, I'll stop for the first time to get some questions. So you don't need to wait until the very, very end. If you've got a question and you want to type it into the chat or wherever the questions are being taken, by all means, go ahead right now. Matt and the Haberman staff will be curating the questions, and at some point we'll pause to take some questions. Then I'll keep on going on with the lecture. We'll take some more questions. So Yitziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus, it's an absolutely central narrative for the Jewish people. We say twice every day the words "L'ma'an tizkaru v'asitem et kol mitzvotai v'tem kedoshim ani Adonai Elohechem asher hotzeti etchem mi'eretz Mitzrayim." Twice a day in the Shema, morning and evening, we end the Shema by referring to the fact that we are obligated to remember that God took us out of the land of Egypt. Every Friday night in Kiddush, we talk about how Shabbat is a Zecher Litziat Mitzrayim, is a reminder of the Exodus from Egypt. This story is absolutely central to our identity as the nation Israel, our identity as the Jewish people, the very authority of Jewish tradition in our lives is explicitly based on the fact that we owe our freedom to God because God took our ancestors out of slavery in Egypt. And so the question of, well, might that event not have in fact occurred? Is it possible that there was no Exodus? I think that that's actually a very, very major question that some Jews, and frankly also quite a few Christians, find worrying, find perhaps even upsetting. I'd like to address this question, the question of, did the Exodus from Egypt happen? Were there in fact ancestors of the Israelites who were enslaved by the Egyptians, who were enslaved in Egypt, who left that slavery, who were freed somehow from that slavery, surprisingly, whose memories of that event became absolutely central to the development of Israelite identity, to the development, to the evolution of the nation Israel in ancient times. That's the question that I'd like to address in light of archaeological evidence and in light of what we know today as modern biblical scholars, in light of the methods and perspectives that modern biblical scholars or biblical critics who are housed at universities, colleges, and seminaries, in light of that field that we biblical scholars are pursuing. Because as probably everybody knows from the media, from newspapers, magazine articles, TV shows, History Channel, you name it, there are people who make the claim that the Exodus never happened. There are people who who raise the question, is it likely that the Exodus ever happened? And there are people who make the claim that, the answer to that is no. The Exodus is a work of fiction. There are people who say that Hebrew writers, Israelite writers, at a certain point of time made up this story. It's a beautiful story, it's an important story, but it's a fictional story. It's not actually describing events that in fact ever occurred. So I'd like to address that challenge to the biblical story. And I'd like to begin my discussion by sharing some terms with you. So at this point, I'm going to share screen, if you'll just give me a moment. Okay, I've hit that little button, and now I want to go to, just one second. There we go. Share. Okay. I want to start by just introducing some terminology that will help us to understand, well, the question, well, why do some people doubt the story in the first place? Why might we suspect that the story of the Exodus that is told in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Torah, the second book of the Pentateuch, is a fictional story? Why do some people suspect that the many references throughout the Bible, not just in the book of Exodus, not just in the Pentateuch, but throughout the entire Jewish Bible, to that story are referring to something that never happened, are alluding to a fictional story as opposed to a historical story? In order to understand why some people even raise the question, why some people doubt that the Exodus story is conveying information about real events, it'll be useful, first of all, just for us to know some terminology and to know a little bit of some history. So let's just look at some terms that will help answer the question, well, why would we doubt it at all to begin with? So let me start with some terms that have to do with historical periods, historical periodization. When we're talking about the history of not just ancient Israel, but the history of the ancient Near East in general, we often talk about the Middle Bronze Age, the Late Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the time of the United Monarchy, the time of the Divided Monarchy, the time of, I should have put this on here, but I say I didn't, the time of the exile. So let me just define these terms. Middle Bronze Age. The Middle Bronze Age is roughly from the 23rd century BCE to the 16th century BCE. The very end of the Middle Bronze Age would be maybe perhaps the time that the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah would have lived. After the Middle Bronze Age, archaeologists and historians speak of the next period as being the Late Bronze Age, which goes roughly from about the 16th century to the 13th century. The patriarchs might have lived, or the patriarchal era, or people corresponding to the patriarchs might have lived towards the beginning or middle of the late Bronze Age. The time that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt should be sometime in the late Bronze Age, and the time of the Exodus should be towards the very end of the late Bronze Age. The next historical period, when we're talking about the Near East, is the Iron Age, as the use of iron becomes more common. Beginning in about the 12th century BCE, beginning about the year 1200 BCE. And that's the period that the nation Israel really emerges in the land of Israel. And this is both, I'm saying that both on the basis of the archaeological record and also on the basis of the biblical documents themselves. That is, we know at what point the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were destroyed by the Assyrian and Babylonian armies, respectively. We have both biblical evidence and plenty of Assyrian and Babylonian evidence about those events, working backwards from the time of the destruction of the first temple, the end of the Judean kingdom, the destruction of the city of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in the year 586 BCE, working backwards and doing the math, it would seem that the Israelites would have begun settling or conquering the central area of the land of Canaan, starting around roughly 1200 BCE, 1250, 1300. Based on the biblical documents, that's when we would expect the Israelites to appear as an ethnic group and even as a national and political group in the highlands of the land of Canaan, or what we call the land of Israel. Not only the biblical documents indicate that, but archaeologically it's clear that the Israelites emerge in the highlands of Canaan beginning in about 1200 BCE, maybe a tiny little bit earlier than that. So the Iron Age, starting about 1200, that's both biblically and archaeologically, that's when a nation Israel is present in the land of Israel. We can talk about the time within the Iron Age of the United Monarchy. That would be the time that the Israelites living in different parts of the highland of Canaan begin to come together as a national group in a national state. This would correspond to the biblical stories about King Saul, the first king, King David, whom we could call the first successful king, and King Solomon. We're talking roughly about the 11th, 10th centuries would be the time of the United Monarchy, Saul, David, and Solomon. That United Monarchy falls apart. There are then two different kingdoms of the Israelites, a northern kingdom, also known as Israel or Ephraim, and then a southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. Those are destroyed by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Their last vestige of independence disappears in the year 586 BCE. That's a hard date. We can debate whether it's 586 or 587, but that's a date for which we have multiple textual archaeological pieces of evidence. Then we get into the Exilic period, which would be the next period when the Judeans are in exile in Babylonia. That's not a very, very long period of time, only about 50 years in length. Then the Persians conquer the Babylonian Empire. The Persians allow Judeans to return to the land of Judah, to the central area in the land of Canaan, where they set up a new temple, the Second Temple, and they become something of a province of the Persian Empire. Okay, with all those dates under our belt, now I'm prepared to explain why modern biblical scholars think it's worth asking the question, in fact, necessary to ask the question, did the Exodus really happen or not? When we're talking about the events of the Exodus, the enslavement itself, the liberation from slavery, we're talking about events that happen at some point in the late Bronze Age. But we modern biblical scholars, modern biblical critics, whether Jewish or Christian, we pretty much all agree that the literature that we find in the Torah, the narratives that we find in the book of Exodus, were written down at some point in the period of the divided monarchy, or maybe in the period of the exile, or immediately after the exile. So we're talking about Iron Age narratives that are describing Bronze Age events. And we're not even talking about Iron Age narratives that were written early in the Iron Age. We're talking about texts in the book of Exodus that are probably being written in the 9th, the 8th, the 7th, the 6th centuries BCE. So the point in time in which the Torah gets written, according to modern biblical scholars, obviously this isn't the position of Orthodox Judaism or of evangelical or fundamentalist Christianity, but according to modern scholars of the Bible, again, both Jewish and Christian, the Torah is written centuries after the time in which the Exodus supposedly takes place. And for that reason, we can wonder, is it really possible that somebody writing in, I don't know, the 8th century BCE really knew what had happened back in the 13th, the 14th century BCE? Or is it more likely that we're dealing here with historical fiction, with fictional writing that's very, very interesting, maybe religiously significant, thematically rich and worth reading, but it's a fiction. It's not really talking about real events. So that's number one. Why do people even ask the question? Well, I think it's a very plausible question. We're talking, as I say, about late Iron Age narratives in the book of Exodus that claim to be talking about events that happened centuries earlier in the Bronze Age. And we can wonder whether it's plausible that Iron Age authors are accurately describing Bronze Age events. Beyond that, there's people who point out some missing, what they think is as missing evidence. So let me just review why some people make the claim that, we can state it's very unlikely that the Exodus occurred. You're going to see that I don't agree with the arguments I'm about to present, but let me at least present those arguments, and then I'm going to respond to them. For one, people often point out, look, archaeologists have been working for a century and a half, close to 2 centuries now, at least a century and a half at least, in Egypt. They've uncovered lots and lots of documents, and there's no references in all this voluminous Egyptian literature that has been discovered by archaeologists, deciphered, and read by Egyptologists. There's no reference to the Israelite slaves. So if the Egyptians don't talk about having had Israelite slaves, there mustn't have been any. Now, this is actually very specious reasoning. That line of argument that I've just summarized holds absolutely no water whatsoever for several reasons. First of all, the fact that there are no references specifically to Israelite slaves in Egyptian documents is hardly surprising, because Egyptian documents don't ever discuss the ethnicity of their slaves in any detailed fashion. When Egyptian documents talk about their slaves, they talk about Asiatic slaves, African slaves, or Libyan slaves. That is, slaves that either came from east of Egypt, that is east or northeast of Egypt, south of Egypt, or west of Egypt. But they don't go into more detail beyond that. So we wouldn't ever expect to find references to Hebrew slaves or Israelite slaves in Egyptian documents. They would just be lumped into the larger category of Asiatic slaves. And indeed, there are many, many references to Asiatic slaves, but Egyptian documents don't get more detailed than that. So the fact that there's no specific reference to Israelite slaves tells us nothing whatsoever. Israelite slaves would have simply been part of the larger category of Asiatic slaves, slaves who came from somewhere east of Egypt. Furthermore, it's worth remembering that when we're dealing with documents from ancient Egypt, we're basically dealing, physically speaking, with two kinds of documents. There were stone documents, and there were documents that were written in papyrus. Stone documents tend to be grandiose. These are monumental inscriptions that were sponsored usually by the pharaonic court, by the court of the pharaoh. They were celebrating great victories or recording important events in Egyptian history. And they tend to survive very well because they're engraved in stone. Many of you have gone to museums, or maybe you've even been in Egypt and you've seen them yourselves. They're designed to last a long time because they are literally written in stone. These grandiose stone records tend not to mention trivial details, and they also tend not to mention defeats. So talking about one little group of slaves, it's just not something that one of these stone documents is going to do. Furthermore, if some of these slaves managed to escape, or especially if they escaped in some ways that were humiliating to the Egyptians, you're not going to find records of this in the stone monuments that have been preserved. But what about the papyrus documents? Papyrus documents, which are probably the vast majority of ancient writing, they deal with much more mundane matters. Maybe we would have expected to see some reference to Israelite slaves there. Okay, even if not by name, even if they weren't called Israelite slaves, maybe we would find something that would point towards the presence of Asiatic slaves who correspond to the Israelites. Here, however, we have to remember that papyrus, that is an early form of something like paper that was made from the reeds that are present along the Nile River and in the Nile Delta. Papyrus does not last well. Relatively few examples of papyrus documents have survived. There are some, and some of them are absolutely fascinating, but it tends to crumble, and so we have far fewer papyrus documents. Those papyrus documents that we do have tend to come from southern Egypt, from the area going towards Aswan, for example, because the climate there is dry. The Bible claims that the Israelite slaves were slaves in the Delta region, that is to say, in northern Egypt. In northern Egypt, there are almost no papyrus. In fact, so far as I know, no papyrus has survived from northern Egypt for two reasons, or I should maybe phrase that differently. Archaeologists have discovered papyrus records from northern Egypt pretty much never, and that's for two reasons. Number one, well, for one thing, there aren't that many archaeological digs in northern Egypt. Most of the great digs occurred in southern Egypt. Northern Egypt, the Delta region, is heavily populated. You can't just start digging there as the way that there are parts of southern Egypt where you can dig. Moreover, in the mud, the alluvial mud of the Delta region, of the Nile Delta region, papyrus is just not going to survive. There are areas in southern Egypt where things are drier, where papyrus has survived. In northern Egypt, papyrus is not going to survive for 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 years. That just doesn't happen. So the absence of references in Egyptian literature to Israelite slaves, that turns out to be a meaningless piece of data. That's an absence that doesn't mean anything. That's an argument from silence that tells us nothing. One other reason that many people say, well, there couldn't have been slaves in Egypt because the number of slaves mentioned is simply completely unrealistic. Now, this is a much more legitimate point. According to the Book of Numbers, there were 603,550 adult males who left Egyptian slavery, not including the tribe of Levi. 603,550 adult males, then throw in the Levite males, throw in women and children, we're probably talking about roughly 2 million, maybe 3 million slaves leaving Egypt one night in April of some year in the late Bronze Age. Yeah, that is an unbelievable story. And if that many people had left, first of all, they couldn't have left in one evening. Any of you who have, tried to get with a bunch of friends and families, some bunch of Jews like to move somewhere easily some evening, with 20 of them, it's hard enough. 2 million, 3 million, yeah, that's just not a realistic story. Had it happened, furthermore, there would be some reference, somehow that would have to be seen in the archaeological record. On the other hand, though, I think that we need to understand the use of numbers by ancient historians. Numbers were used typologically, they were used symbolically, and they were used in what to us is a numerically exaggerated fashion. Ancient historians of any kind, Egyptian, Israelite, Babylonian, Greek, they didn't use numbers the way that contemporary historians and journalists use numbers. When they say 600,000, they don't literally mean 600,000. So I don't think that we have to tie the whole Exodus story into this idea that there were 603,550 Israelites who left, and that's the exact number. And if that's not true, then the whole story is untrue. I think the story may be a true story, but we shouldn't, of course, take that number literally any more than the Bible intends us to take, 7 24-hour periods for creation in Genesis 1 literally. That's just not how the Bible expects anybody to read it. Modern fundamentalist Christians who read it that way are reading the Bible in a grossly anachronistic and really, I think, inaccurate and thus disrespectful way. Furthermore, there are plenty of other documents and verses in the Bible itself that make it clear that not all biblical authors thought that many people left Egypt. In the book of Exodus chapter 33 or the book of Numbers chapter 11, for example, it's clear from the stories that are found in Exodus 33, Numbers 11, it's clear that the Israelites were all able to see Moses when Moses went out to a particular tent that was located outside of the camp. So the Israelite camp was some area. Outside that camp, there was a tent. Moses used to walk to that tent to commune with God, and all the Israelites could see when Moses walked out to that tent. Now, if there were 2 million Israelites, then, well, that's like the size of Brooklyn in terms of population. Plus, they didn't live in high rises. They lived in tents. So if anything, it would be more spread out than Brooklyn. That's a camp that is just gigantic. It's not the case that all the Israelites in an area that's like the size of Brooklyn plus Queens would have been able to see Moses walking out to this little tent that was located a half mile or a mile away from the camp. Clearly, Exodus chapter 33, Numbers chapter 11, they are imagining the Israelite camp as consisting of, a few hundred people, maybe 1,000 people. The number of people who left Egypt, according to those texts, is vastly smaller. And actually, most texts in the Torah that give us any sense of how large the camp was, most of them seem to be assuming it's a fairly small space. So even the biblical record, even the biblical authors themselves don't usually say, yeah, it was really 603,550. No, the Exodus event that most biblical texts are remembering or referring to or narrating involved a far smaller group of people. So I don't think that, while it certainly is the case that the number 603,550 is utterly unbelievable, we shouldn't get too tripped up by that particular number. The actual number of people who left Egypt, from other biblical documents, it's very clear that number was much, 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 much smaller. Okay, so far what I've done is I've shown that the people who claim, yes, we can say that archaeologically we know the Exodus didn't happen, those people really just don't know the nature of the data. They don't know what the archaeological data is. They don't know what the archaeological data can indicate. The absence of reference to the Israelites in Egypt, that's a meaningless piece of data. That's an argument from silence that we can't learn anything from. Reference to that number, 603,550, that's kind of a red herring. That's not a real argument against the historicity of the Exodus story, because those numbers aren't intended to be taken literally, and many biblical documents don't even believe in those numbers. They give a very different impression about the number of people who left Egypt. So what I've done so far, I hope, is I think that I've shown that the claims that the Exodus could not have occurred, those are not well thought out, well supported historical claims. Historically, there's no reason to think the Exodus didn't occur, but I haven't yet made it likely, made the case that it's likely that the Exodus did occur. That's what I'd like to go on to do in the next part of my lecture. But let me just stop here and see if, Matt, are there any questions so far that we should pause and take? So far, I've kind of been doing something negative. I'm just saying people who claim that the Exodus definitely didn't occur, frankly, they don't know what they're talking about. Before I move on to making some positive claims, let's just see if there are questions about this part as far as I've gone, or some of the terminology that I've listed.
Great. Thank you so far. It's very fascinating so far. And there's a number of questions that I think are relative at this time. Some of them I may save for later and toward the end. But you had mentioned that about not taking parts literally. And so there's a couple of questions about about the splitting of the Red Sea or maybe other miracles. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that at this time, comparing that to maybe the number of people leaving Egypt.
So the question of miracles, splitting of the Red Sea, the plagues, I think that's, I personally think that that's separate from the issue of whether the Exodus ever in fact occurred. That is to say, it is possible that the Exodus occurred and these miracles didn't exactly happen, or that some extraordinary events did help the Exodus occur, and those events were then remembered and sort of multiplied, exaggerated in Israelite historical memory, and those produce the narratives about the miracles. Or it's perfectly possible, as far as I'm concerned, that these miracles did did occur. I mean, if one believes in a personal God, then the possibility of a miracle is hardly a possibility to be discounted. But I guess in today's lecture, I'm trying to make a purely historical argument without recourse to religious belief or to faith commitments. I'm going to be trying to make an argument that the Exodus story is based on real events, and so I don't want to make the assumption that these miracles really occurred. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but they're irrelevant to the historical claim that I'm making in today's lecture, this evening's lecture. I think it is perfectly possible that there were real events that are remembered in Israelite historical memory. Stories about them are passed on over generations, and centuries later, when they're written down, they have been multiplied, they have been embellished, and therefore they contain some elements that are not historical. That the narrative in the book of Exodus includes some elements that are fictional, some elements that are heavily embellished, some elements that are exaggerated, doesn't mean that the core story itself is not true. So 603,550, yeah, for sure that's not true. Splitting of the Red Sea, lots of frogs. I can't say as a historian whether that's true or not true, but you can believe in the basic plot of the Exodus story, namely, ancestors of the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, and surprisingly, they went free. You can believe that that is a true story, whether or not you take the story about the frogs or the locusts literally. Does that seem to address the issue, Matt? Or do you want to follow up?
Yeah, no, I think that addresses the question at this time. So yeah, thank you. There's a huge number of questions that have come in. I'm going to try to stick to the ones that seem most relevant in the moment. There's somebody who cites a theory that maybe the Exodus was dated incorrectly, and which is why maybe it doesn't show up in Egyptian history. Is there anything to that idea?
I tend not to think so, because even if we go with that theory, so the Exodus didn't happen in the 13th century, maybe it happened in the 11th century. Okay, but it doesn't show up in the 11th century in Egyptian documents either. Maybe it happened in the 17th century. Yeah, it doesn't show up in the 17th century either. So changing the date doesn't change anything. The core issue there is that there's no reason that we should ever expect to find reference to Israelite slaves specifically in Egyptian documents. Egyptian documents just don't talk about the specific ethnicity of slaves beyond just calling them Asiatic or Ethiopian or actually Nubian, I should say, or Libyan. Furthermore, if there ever were real documents that referred to actual Israelite slaves, those documents would have been in papyrus, not in stone, and they would have been located in the Delta region. And those documents have, crumbled in the mud of the Delta region 3,000 years ago. The main issue there, it's not a dating issue. It's the fact that Egyptians don't talk about the ethnicity of their slaves and furthermore, any actual real life documents reflecting the enslavement of the Israelites would be papyrus documents that would not have survived in the Delta region.
Thank you. There's a question here on the Merneptah Stela and whether that is of assistance in talking about the possibility of the Exodus.
So let me come back to the Merneptah Stela. That gets us more into some some of the evidence I'm getting into a little bit later in the lecture. So I'm gonna punt on that one for the moment.
Okay, great, thank you.
So maybe I'll go on to the positive stuff now, and Matt, you can also maybe, if there's some questions you want to get around to, bringing them into the next round. But let me ask the question. Okay, so there's no evidence that the Exodus didn't happen. Is there any evidence that the Exodus did happen? And again, by that I mean not necessarily that every single detail that we find in the book of Exodus is accurate, but is the general historical narrative referring to events that in fact occurred. That is to say, there were Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt in the late Bronze period, who were freed from that slavery somehow towards the very end of the late Bronze period. Is there evidence that that did happen? Well, there's no absolute proof outside the Bible itself, nor can we expect any. I mean, I don't think we're going to like dig up a diary of some Israelite slave, in the Sinai desert that confirms everything. But there are a lot of indicators that suggest that the story in the book of Exodus is based on real historical memories that go back to the mid to late second millennium. That is to say, there are a number of indicators that make it likely that the book of Exodus, which is written down in the Iron Age, is preserving data that goes back to the late Bronze Age. Again, the reason that it makes sense to ask this question at all is that there is this gap of half a millennium between when the book of Exodus gets written, according to modern biblical scholars such as myself, and when these events occurred. But there are a lot of details in the book of Exodus that somebody making up a story in the Iron Age could not have gotten right. These are details that have to have come down in some form, probably oral tradition, maybe in written documents, but probably oral tradition, have to have come from an oral tradition that goes back to the time of the Exodus itself. So let me give you a couple of examples. So according to Exodus chapter 1, specifically this is verse 11, the Israelites built two cities. What the Israelite slaves were tasked with doing was building two cities. One of those cities is called Ramses. And indeed, there was a city. In fact, there were several cities with the name Ramses or Pi Ramses in Egyptian. They were all built by a pharaoh named Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great. You might have heard about him or seen pictures of his death mask, who ruled in the 1200s BCE. Now, what's interesting about the city of Ramses is that it was built, in particular, there was the great city of Ramses named after the pharaoh himself, which was located in the Delta region. This would be the first area that Israelites coming from Canaan would have encountered as they entered Egypt. It's built by Ramses in the 1200s BCE, that's to say the 13th century BCE, and he makes it his capital city. And it remains the capital city of Ramses and his son. It remains the capital city for about a century or a bit longer. But the Nile River changes its course over time. And when the Nile River changes its course in the century after the city was built, it ends up becoming a landlocked city. So Ramses ends up, being like a city that was located on, Federal Route 66 before President Eisenhower began building the highways that we've got today. A new highway gets built, and this city ends up being a backwater. Ramses, the city of Ramses, does not remain the capital of Egypt because it is landlocked. It's not easy to get to anymore. The capital then moves to another city farther north, which is known as Tanis in English or in Greek. This is Tsoan in Hebrew. When the Bible was being written, when the book of Exodus is being written in the 8th, the 7th, the 6th century BCE, the city of Ramses no longer exists. It has been abandoned because it was landlocked, and the capital city is now in Soan or Tanis. An Israelite writer making up a fictional story about a pharaoh in the 8th century, the 6th century BCE, such a writer would not make up a story that is set in the city of Ramses, because such a writer probably wouldn't have known that there once had been such a city. That wasn't part of contemporary knowledge. Writers in the ancient world, the biblical writers, they tend to write anachronistically. They tend to talk about things in the past using as their basic reference point the world that they know. And there are some other Israelite writers who actually do refer to the city of Tanis or Tsoan as being a place that played a role in the Exodus story. But what's interesting is that the book of Exodus doesn't do that. The book of Exodus locates the story accurately where the story should have been happening in the late Bronze Age. There's no way an Iron Age writer would have known about the city of Ramses. And so the fact that that detail is correct, that's really quite interesting. That suggests that maybe this story that was being written down was preserving historical memories that actually went back to the late Bronze Age. Otherwise, how did they know about the existence of that city at all? The other city that the Israelites build is Pitom. They say that they build the cities of Pitom veRamses. There's disagreement about where Pitom was located. Scholars debate about this quite a bit, and so I'm not even going to enter into that debate. All I could say is we're not 100% sure where Pitom was, and therefore whether it was inhabited or not inhabited at this point in time or that point in time, we can't know, because we're not 100% sure where it was located. But it is interesting to note that Pitom and Ramses are mentioned together in Egyptian literature in texts that date from the time of Ramses II, Ramses the Great, and also his son Merneptah. Those are the only Egyptian texts that mention Pitom and Ramses as a pair. It would be an extraordinary coincidence if an Iron Age, first millennium Hebrew writer makes up a story about second millennium Egypt and just happens to mention these two cities together, when actually in the late Bronze Age, in the time of Ramses and Merneptah, Ramses II and Merneptah, those two cities are mentioned together. They're a pair, but they're only a pair for a few generations at the very end of the late Bronze Age. It would be a heck of a coincidence if an Israelite writer centuries and centuries later just happened to mention those two cities together, but it would be quite explicable if that Israelite writer was depending on a tradition, on some historical tradition, oral or written, probably oral, that goes all the way back all those centuries. If the Israelites really were enslaved in Egypt and they remembered that Pitom and Ramses were a pair and that they had worked on building those two cities, and then Israelite cultural memory keeps that pair together for centuries and centuries, okay, then we can understand why when that tradition finally gets written down in the 8th, the 7th, the 6th century BCE, that late Bronze Age pairing is still preserved as a pairing. As a fiction, that would be really one heck of a coincidence. As a piece of historical memory that had been preserved for centuries, it's entirely understandable. Another little detail, and it's interesting, it's a lot of these little details that are especially revealing here. In Exodus 13:17, in Parshat Bishalach, we're told that when the Israelites left Egypt, God didn't want to take them to the land of Canaan using the direct route, which would go up through the northern Sinai, and what's known as Derech Eretz Plishtim, by going by way of the land of the Philistines through the northern Sinai up through Gaza. And that verse, Exodus 13:17, says that God said, "Pen yinachem ha'am bir'otam milchama v'shavu mitzrayma." I don't want to take them on that route, lest the people regret leaving Egypt when they see warfare and then they return to Egypt. What is this talking about? What does it mean? Why going on that route would they be seeing warfare and getting frightened? Well, it turns out only in the last roughly 30 years, based on the archaeological digs that were done in the Sinai Desert, in the northern Sinai, and the northeastern area of the delta, of the Nile Delta, it turns out that there were forts on that road. That's the main road that leads from Egypt into the land of Canaan. And during the late Bronze Age, the Egyptians had a series of forts along that road to protect people who were going on that trade route, the main trade route really between Egypt and Asia. Every 50 miles or so, it turns out, there was a fort. But those forts were abandoned in the 1100s BCE. Those forts were abandoned, covered with sand, except for one of them, and only rediscovered in the 1970s. These were dug up by an archaeologist from Illinois, as a matter of fact, in the 1970s. At the time when the book of Exodus was being written, the 8th century, the 7th century, the 6th century BCE, nobody knew about these forts. No one had seen these forts for the past 400 years, the past 500 years. A person writing a fictional story about people escaping Egypt wouldn't have had a reason for saying, let's not take the northern route, because that might have been scary because of the presence of warfare. Let's take them in an indirect route through a different part of the Sinai Peninsula. That's just not a plot detail that makes any sense for a fictional writer in the Iron Age in Israel. But that is a plot detail that makes a lot of sense if the Israelites were actually leaving Egypt in the time of Ramses II or the time of Merneptah, or even in the time of Ramses III, that is to say, at the end of the late Bronze Age, because, yeah, at that point in time, if you were an escaping slave, that is not a route that you would have wanted to take. You would not want to be going right by on a road that is guarded all the way by Egyptian soldiers. You'd want to be taking an alternate route that takes you through a wilderness where there aren't Egyptian soldiers. Again, it's a little detail, but it's a detail that it's interesting that they get that detail right. We might also add, and this is something that Gary Rensburg from Rutgers University points out, that in the 12th century, the Philistines and what are known as the Sea Peoples are beginning to invade, or at least to do a series of raids in northern Egypt, the Sinai Desert, and into the land of Canaan along that northern route. In the very, very end of the late Bronze Age, that might have been a dangerous route because there was warfare that occasionally took place there with the entrance of the Philistines from the Mediterranean Sea. Again, that makes sense, in particular at that point in time. Centuries later, when the book of Exodus is written, that's just not a plot detail you would have naturally made up, and it wasn't necessarily even remembered that the Philistines had arrived at that point in time. In fact, the biblical authors don't realize this. The biblical authors think that the Philistines had been in the land of Canaan much, much earlier. They talk about Abraham and Isaac having interactions with the Philistines. They think the Philistines have been there for a long time. That's actually not true. Abraham and Isaac could not have met any Philistines. The Philistines hadn't yet made it to the land of Canaan at the time of Abraham and Isaac, at the very beginning of the late Bronze Age or the end of the Middle Bronze Age. So Israelite fiction writers in the the 8th century, the 7th century, they wouldn't have located this warfare involving the Philistines on that route at the time of the Exodus. But if there were real historical memories that there was warfare taking place along that route, in the very late Bronze Age, yeah, in that case, that would just be part of the story that was preserved by people who remembered this event, and they passed that detail on for many centuries. Another example, if I may, of some details that link the Exodus story very closely with the very end of the late Bronze Age that, again, a later author could never have known. This detail, a number of details, have to do with a particular battle that took place in the year 1274 BCE. That's in the early 13th century BCE. It's called the Battle of Kadesh. It was a battle between the Egyptians, led by the Pharaoh Ramses II, and the Hittites, whose empire was located in what today is central and eastern Turkey. There was a battle, major battle that took place actually in Syria between the Egyptian army and the Hittite army. The Egyptians claimed that they won that battle, which may or may not really be true. The Hittites also claimed to have won the battle. But anyway, the propaganda back in Egypt was, we won this battle. And there were 3 large inscriptions inscribed into stone that told the story of this battle. There were also 2 papyrus texts that were preserved that tell the story of this battle. Now, there are a couple of elements of this battle that took place supposedly about in the time that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, maybe shortly before the Exodus. There are a number of elements of these 3 monumental inscriptions describing the battle that are relevant to the book of Exodus. And so for this, I'm going to move us down to the 3rd page of our handout here. And I want to also change the zoom just so we can see this a little bit better. Let me go down to fit width. I think that'll be what I need. Yeah. Okay. So if you look at this, this is the inscription in its various forms includes an illustration. The illustration is what we've got a picture of here. This is an illustration of the camp of the Egyptian army that went off to battle. You'll see that you got the army. You can see this like little hand. Does everyone see that? Matt or Sandra, can you see me moving this cursor here? Is that showing up?
Yeah, we
okay.
can.
So you've got over here the boundary of the camp. Main entrance is over here. You see the army, different horses, chariotry, and so forth. And then over here on the right side, there is the tent where Pharaoh himself resides. And remember that the Egyptians consider Pharaoh to be a god. Very different from Israelite religion, very different from Babylonian and Assyrian religion. Pharaoh is actually considered to be a god. So this tent isn't just the royal tent, it's the tent in which a divine being is traveling off to battle. And you'll see that within this larger camp, the Pharaoh's tent is a rectangle. It's roughly divided into the left side, which is maybe about 2/3 of this area, and the right side is maybe 1/3 of the area. Pharaoh actually dwells in the smaller chamber, this chamber off to the right side that takes up about 1/3 of the area. And if we look in more detail there, so I'm going to zoom again. Let's go back up to, let's say, I don't know, 125. Oops. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. Fit width let's do 130. Okay, if we go and take a look at the Pharaoh's tent, we see some people bowing down to this divine being over on the left side, the larger part of the tent. On the right side, this area in the middle, this oval, inside there, you can't read it here, are hieroglyphic signs saying that this is where Pharaoh is, that this oval represents where Pharaoh is actually sitting enthroned in his portable throne going to battle. And you can see that on the sides, there are 2 winged figures. These winged figures have the face of a human, but are mythological figures because they've got sort of a face, but not a regular. Oops, sorry there. Not a regular human face. It seems to be the face of a bird. And then these wings, and they're sort of paying homage to Pharaoh on each side of Pharaoh's actual chamber in this tent. Now, I think probably many of you know where I'm going with this already. If you're familiar with the book of Exodus, the book of Exodus goes on to describe the tabernacle that the Israelites took through the desert. The tabernacle looks extraordinarily similar to Ramses' camp. You've got a larger area around the edge. This is Ramses' camp. This is kind of like a more schematic diagram of what we just looked at. The tabernacle that's described in the book of Exodus, in fact, we're reading that part of the book of Exodus right now in shul on Saturday mornings. That tabernacle is also a large rectangle within which there is the tent where God actually resides. That tent has 2 different parts, a larger section over to the left And then the right side, the Holy of Holies, that's where God actually dwells, inside the Holy of Holies. That's where God's throne was believed to be, in the Mishkan, or the Tabernacle. And some of you might remember that around the ark in the Tabernacle are two keruvim, two cherubs. These keruvim were figures that had the face of a human, the body probably of some sort of animal like a bull or something like that, and wings. There are these two winged creatures who surround the presence of God over here in the Holy of Holies. The tabernacle, the Mishkan that we read about in the book of Exodus, is stunningly familiar to Ramses II's camp. Something that scholars of history, scholars of the history of culture, have pointed out in many, many cases around the world is what's sometimes called elite emulation. An oppressed people who are trying to gain their freedom, or who do gain their freedom, will very, very often emulate or imitate something in the culture of their oppressor. So in India, during the time of the British Raj, upper class Indians were often very, very British. They might go to study in Cambridge or in Oxford. They read Dickens, they read other 19th century English literature, they read Shakespeare, they read Keats and Byron and Shelley. In fact, to this day, one of the places where you can often find a real classical, old-fashioned British education are in upper class schools in India, upper class or upper caste even schools in India. We can go find plenty of other examples of this kind of elite emulation. It seems that the book of Exodus is engaging in elite emulation. Ramses II had spread this propaganda about his great victory against the Hittites throughout Egypt. Diagrams and pictures of his camp were known during his time, during the time of Ramses, probably in the time of his son Merneptah. The Israelites, gaining their freedom sometime around this era, maybe a little after the time of Ramses, maybe during the time of Merneptah, they carry the cultural memory of this this camp that went through the Sinai Desert up into Canaan and up into Syria to fight the Hittites. They carry this Egyptian propaganda, and they probably imitate it when they build, or they tell stories about building, their own camp. They want to build a tabernacle for their God. They're not accepting Ramses as their overlord anymore. They're not accepting the idea that he's their God. They've got their own God. Not surprisingly, they give their own God a home that imitates this Egyptian camp, and it's specifically an Egyptian camp from the time of Ramses II. You might notice we keep on coming back to Ramses II. The city of Ramses that they built was built in the time of Ramses II. Pitom and Ramses, those two cities are mentioned together in Egyptian literature of the era of Ramses II and his son Merneptah. I think it's very, very likely that the Israelites were enslaved, were slaves during the time of Ramses II, were freed sometime shortly thereafter, and they're taking a lot of Ramesside era Egyptian culture with them, and that becomes a core part of their own cultural memory that they pass on over generations. Now, an Israelite, if an Israelite had been making this story up in the 8th century, the 7th century, these are details, again, they would not have known. You might say, well, look, maybe it's a piece of fiction that somebody's writing in the 8th century, but it's kind of like James Michener. They want to, they want to make it look authentic. James Michener used to do a lot of research when he would write his historical novels. He would, later in his career, when he had the money, he would hire graduate students from history departments in various areas to help him with the research, to write up reports, because he wanted to get the details right. If he was writing about Hawaii in the 19th century, he wanted to get those details right. He traveled to Hawaii. He went to archives. He tried to get his details right. In the 8th century BCE, nobody did that. People didn't think historically. People didn't stop to think about the fact that things might have been different 500 years ago. I better go research what things were like so that I can get my details right. That's just not how people thought about history. They didn't realize how much things changed. Even if somebody had thought about that, an Israelite scribe writing a story about something that happened 500 years ago would not have known Egyptian. Israelite scribes wouldn't have had the tools to start reading Egyptian records. They wouldn't have been able to read Egyptian quite literally. Some Israelite scribes could have read Babylonian, but they would not have been able to read Egyptian. Even if somehow they had found, online some Zoom course on learning Egyptian hieroglyphics, which is unlikely, they wouldn't have been able to see many of these inscriptions. The three extant stone inscriptions that preserve this story and this illustration of Ramses, you would have to go to three particular temples, go behind a pillar, climb up on a ladder to find this. It wasn't an easy thing to find. Back in the time of the Exodus, it was easy to find. It was royal propaganda that was spread throughout Egypt. In the 8th, the 7th, the 6th century BCE, aside from the fact that no Israelite writer it would never have occurred to them to apply to the NEH for grant money for them to take a trip to Egypt. Even if they had done that, they didn't know Egyptian, they couldn't have read hieroglyphics, it wouldn't have helped them. Even if they knew hieroglyphics, why would they have gone to that particular temple, taken a ladder behind that particular pillar, climbed up and seen this particular inscription out of thousands of inscriptions that they could have seen? No, an 8th century writer didn't know these details about Ramses's battle camp. Rather, what's going on is the Israelites from the time of the late Bronze Age knew about this battle camp, probably because they were actually in Egypt. They emulated the culture of their oppressor when they wrote their own history, and so they wrote about their own tabernacle, the Mishkan, having the same shape as as Ramses' camp. That point that I just made was especially made by a scholar named Michael Homan, who teaches at Xavier University. Subsequently, a scholar from Bar Ilan University, Joshua Behrman, whom some of you may have heard of, some of you may have read his stuff. Haberman Institute may have had him in for a lecture. If you hadn't, you probably should. So Josh Berman from Bar Ilan University, he points out something additional about this Egyptian text. So the Egyptian text has an illustration. There's also a narrative that tells the story of Ramses's alleged victory against the Hittites. There are certain elements that show up in this story that also show up in the story of the Exodus in Exodus chapters 13 through 15, and they go in the same order. Now, some of these elements, they're going to show up in any story about warfare, but some of them are more specific. There's a march out to battle. We're told that that our side lacks confidence, that they're very, very nervous and frightened. That is, the Ramses inscription says that the Egyptian army were terribly nervous. Parshat Bishalach says that the Israelites escaping slavery were terribly nervous just before they go through the Reed Sea. Then the deity of the winning side attacks and specifically drowns the enemies. That is, in the Egyptian text, Ramses, as a god, attacks the Hittites and drowns them. That's kind of specific. Warfare doesn't usually involve drowning, but specifically it's that the Hittites get drowned in the Orontes River. Similarly, in the book of Exodus, God causes the Egyptian army to go into the Reed Sea, and then, of course, God pours the water in on top of them, drowning the Egyptian army. We're told that the rest of the enemy flees. In the biblical text, they try to flee, but they're not able to. They end up drowning. Then in both of these, the victorious side, whether the Egyptians in the Egyptian text, the Israelites in the book of Exodus, they view the corpses of the drowned enemies and they proceed to sing a song of praise to the enemy. The song in Exodus is Exodus chapter 15. Then the winning side, the Egyptians or the Israelites, marches onward past other nations on their way to their homeland, where they're told that their deity enjoys eternal rule. Now, some of these elements, you're just going to get them in any story of a military victory, but some of these elements are more specific. The drowning, our side seeing the drowned bodies and then singing a song of praise, marching up past other nations who aren't part of the fight, but just get to witness our victory. there are enough points of contact here that Josh suggests, Professor Berman suggests, that the book of Exodus here too is imitating the story that comes from Ramses II's time of his victory against the Hittites. Again, it's an example of an oppressed people imitating the literature of their enemies. When telling the story of their own rescue, they embellish of their own exodus from slavery. They embellish that story by putting it into a literary format that they're borrowing specifically from their oppressor, which, again, this happens around the world again and again. We could go through some other examples. I think I'd like to stop here. There's one more that I'll want to tell that I'll want to get to, but why don't we stop here to take some questions? Let me just sum up this part of the lecture. Again and again, we find that the book of Exodus preserves details about the time of the late Bronze Age in Egypt that an Israelite fiction writer in the 8th or 7th century couldn't have made up. And that strongly suggests that this story, whatever embellishments might have occurred over time, is preserving real historical memories that go back 500 years, that go back to the late Bronze Age. And therefore, no, this isn't a fictional story. This is a historical memory of an actual event that happened at the end of the Bronze Age that was passed on generation after generation, and later took the form that we know it of, in which we know it today, that is the form it has in the book of Exodus. And again, I've only given a couple examples, there are more examples I could give. When we can be specific, it's not just the late Bronze Age, it's the time of Ramses II, maybe the time of his son Merneptah, maybe the time of the next major pharaoh, Ramses III. Again and again, little details keep on pointing us back to the 13th century BCE, the 12th century BCE. Somebody making up a story, even if they were trying to sort of get some real Egyptian flavor, so they're borrowing elements from Egypt, they wouldn't keep on sending us to the 13th century. They would just be taking random Egyptian little bits of information that are available to them. That's not what's happening in the book of Exodus. It keeps on pointing us specifically to the 13th and 12th century, and often to details that somebody later on couldn't have known until the advent of modern archaeology in the 20th century, over the past 100 years. Why don't I pause here before I go on to one other very significant piece of evidence? Let's pause here for some more questions.
Great. Thank you. Dr. Sommer, you can probably go ahead and stop your screen share if you want.
Gotcha. So I'll just mention, by the way, page 2 here, and you can get from the Haberman Institute a PDF of this. They might put it up in the chat, or maybe you can email them. For people who are curious, the second page, which we haven't looked at, I've just included a whole lot of bibliography. And so if you want to get that bibliography, you can, that can be supplied somehow, maybe through the chat or something as a PDF, along with the rest of the handout.
Great, thank you. There's a number of questions coming in different directions about, we mentioned at the beginning about the number of people leaving wasn't likely. And so, you've put up, a great case for the likelihood of the Exodus narrative at that time. So, I guess the question some people are asking is like, what is the, which type of people may have left? Like some are mentioning Richard Elliott Friedman's work on maybe some of the Levites left, and
right, that's the next element of the lecture. So maybe let's skip that question, because that's the next thing I want to get to.
All right, great. There's a question here that it's more of just a technical question. Just why didn't they write down the material earlier in their journey? Was the Hebrew language still developing at that time? Like why is there a gap in history?
The gap in the time. The truth is that it's possible that they did. I kept on saying probably oral history, but maybe written records. I said that over and over again. It is possible that they did write, that some of these records were written down earlier. Nevertheless, we modern Bible scholars, for a number of reasons, we tend to think that the going theory is that pretty much all modern Bible scholars agree that the 5 books of Moses were put together from several earlier blocks of material, 3 or 4 earlier blocks of material. They're probably put together into the Torah as we know them during or shortly after the exile. The blocks of material themselves, scholars disagree about. Some scholars think that they were written as late as the 5th or the 6th century BCE. Other scholars think that they were written down or they began to be written down as early as the 8th century BCE. But those blocks of material, they're probably not a lot older than that. So for example, one of the main blocks of material is what we call the priestly document. The priestly document, which tells the story of the Exodus, and also has all that information about the tabernacle. All the tabernacle stuff is coming from what we call the P document, or the priestly document. I think it's clear for a number of reasons that it's written down before the exile. It probably starts to be written down around the 8th century BCE. It's probably not a lot older than that. And the reason we can say that is on the basis of its language. The Hebrew language, like all languages, evolves. There are differences between archaic Hebrew, let's say Hebrew of the 12th, 11th centuries, what we might call classical biblical Hebrew, which is Hebrew of the 9th, the 8th, the 7th centuries. There's late classical, which we can identify in the 7th and the 6th centuries. And then there's what's called post-exilic Hebrew, which looks substantially different. The language, pretty much the language of actually all the documents, J, E, P, and D, some of you have probably heard about these other documents. All these documents are written in classical biblical Hebrew with some elements of late classical biblical Hebrew. This seems to be the Hebrew of the 8th and the 7th and the 6th centuries. The little bit of writing that we have from much earlier than that, that would go back to the 12th or the 11th centuries, or even the 10th century, it's linguistically noticeably different. Maybe the Song of the Sea, Exodus 15, goes back as far as that. The Song of Deborah, Judges chapter 5 probably goes back as far as that. A few snippets here and there in the Bible, and linguistically, that's different than regular biblical Hebrew. Some of you who know Hebrew well, even if you can read biblical stories and understand them, you probably notice that reading Judges chapter 5 is really hard. Exodus 15, the Hebrew is really hard. That's because it's a slightly earlier dialect of Hebrew. We also have a very small number of inscriptions from before the 8th century. And again, their Hebrew is just noticeably different. You get to, then suddenly in the 8th century, we start getting, archaeologists find a far larger amount of writing happening in the 8th century. We've got more inscriptions, and those inscriptions are written in the same dialect that the Bible is written in. And so I think that the Torah literature, J, E, P, and D, is probably starting to get written down in the time of the 8th century, which is when writing seems suddenly to become much, much more common in ancient Israel. By the way, that's also the time you might notice that the writing prophets first emerged. There were prophets before then, but they didn't leave us books. There's no book by Elijah. There's no book by Elisha. There's no book by Samuel. There's a book of Samuel in which Samuel's a character, but Samuel doesn't write a book. The first prophets who leave us books of their own speeches, Isaiah, Amos, Hosea, Micah, those are all 8th century prophets. The 8th century is, for some reason, when writing becomes a much more prevalent cultural practice in ancient Israel, and the Bible is written in the kind of Hebrew that you find in the 8th century, the 7th century, the 6th century. So that's why maybe there were other written records, but very little of those have been preserved. Maybe Exodus 15 is an example of something that goes back that far. But if there were other ones, maybe the authors of the book of Exodus consulted them, but we don't have those records. What we've got is the JEP and D documents that we find in the Torah, and linguistically, those are 8th, 7th, 6th century documents.
Great, thank you. I want to recognize the time, and I want to make sure you have enough time to finish your presentation. So I think we can.
Okay, so let me go on to the Levites.
Yeah.
So one other very, very interesting pattern. This was actually first noted by a Canadian Bible scholar who had the unlikely name Theophile Meek, literally Theophile Meek. If I'd made that up, you would have said that it's impossible. It's got to be a fictional name. But no, he actually really did live. He was a professor at the University of Toronto. And in the 1930s, he pointed out a pattern. More recently, Richard Elliott Friedman, among others, has paid a lot of attention to this pattern as well. The pattern is that, well, though the Bible tells us that all 12 tribes of Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, the truth is that pretty much every named character who plays any significant role in the story is from the tribe of Levi. There are no Benjaminites who play a real major role in the story of the Exodus. There are no Judahites that play a role in the story. They're all Levites: Moshe, Aharon, Miriam, Amram, Yocheved, Korach, possibly Hur. They're all Levites. Number one. That's a little odd. If it's a story about all the Israelites, why are all the important characters Levites? Another thing that Meek pointed out back in the 1930s, throughout Israelite history, we find that members of the tribe of Levi, or the tribe of Levy, they often have Egyptian names instead of Hebrew names. And some Levites have regular Hebrew names, but you find that there are a number of Levites that have Egyptian names. Moshe is an Egyptian name. Although the Bible gives a Hebrew etymology to the name, it's really clearly an Egyptian name. It just means son. Pinchas is an Egyptian name. Pashhur is an Egyptian name. Probably Hur is an Egyptian name. And it's specifically the tribe of Levi. And they keep these names in use for generations and generations. That tends to be the case, that once a family is using a name, people keep on being named after that character. So the same name can be can remain in use, for hundreds of years. Up until the time of the destruction of the first temple, you find Levites have Egyptian names, but other Israelites almost never have Egyptian names. We do get other lists of names in the book of Numbers of people who were supposedly from that time that left Egypt, but none of them have Egyptian names. So Theophile Meek put these two pieces of evidence together and suggests that, maybe it was actually the Levites who were enslaved in Egypt. The Levites who were surprisingly liberated from slavery, but the other Israelites, they had been back in the land of Canaan the whole time. Then the Levites come into the land of Canaan. It's interesting that the tribe of Levi never gets its own land. The other 12 tribes all have their own plot of land. There's Judah in the south, then Benjamin, then Ephraim, then Manasseh. They've all got their different areas that they live in. But the Levites, Meek suggests, well, maybe the reason they've got no land is that they arrived late. Maybe they got back into the land of Israel and reunited with their Israelite long-lost cousins at a time that the land had already actually been pretty much allotted. And so the Levites, they become the priestly class of ancient Israel. They support themselves not through agriculture primarily, but through working as priests in various locations, but they never get their own land. And then because they're the priestly, they're the scribal, they're the scholarly class, because they're the ones who preserve historical memory, it ends up being the case that their historical memory is the memory of all the Israelites. Their intense memory of a force for freedom, a force for justice, a force for compassion that liberated them from their situation of slavery. It's around that memory of that force that liberated them that their identity begins to develop, and that identity becomes the identity of all the Israelites, because the Levites are the priestly class of Israel, are teaching the Israelites' history. And so a memory of what happened to one group of Israelites, in a sense, is nationalized. And we should all we're all familiar with this. I mean, in American culture, I dare say that I'm told that there are about 400 people out there, and probably every single one of us had a Thanksgiving meal. We had what anthropologists would call, we had a communal, familial, ritual meal on the fourth Thursday, and every year we do it on the fourth Thursday of November. Is it the fourth Thursday? I think that's right. But of the 400 of us, all of whom, except for the vegetarians, ate turkey, and even the vegetarians might have had, tofu in the shape of a turkey. We all did this ritual meal, but how many of us actually had ancestors on the Mayflower? Of the 400 of us, most of us Jews, somewhere between none of us and a very, very tiny number of us actually had ancestors on the Mayflower. That's a memory that has been nationalized. It's been ritualized. Almost all of us Americans participate in the ritual, even though we weren't all literally descended from people who crossed over on the Mayflower. Or to give another example, more recent, if you've ever been in Israel on Yom HaShoah, on Holocaust Memorial Day, you know about the Tzfirah. It's one of the most impressive things you can, all year long, that you see and hear in Israel. You know that the siren goes off at a certain point in time. And all the Jews in Israel stop what they're doing for 1 minute while the siren is sirening, whatever the verb is. They stop. I don't know if you've ever been on a highway. I was once on a highway when this happened. It's extraordinarily moving to see. The entire highway stops. People get out of their cars. I was on a bus. We tried standing. Everyone stands up, which we tried to do on a bus, which isn't so easy. And all the Jews do this, including Edot HaMizrach Jews and Yemenite Jews. In other words, including Jews who were not, whose families, whose communities were not directly affected by the Holocaust. But in these cases, just 1-2 generations after the Holocaust, which happened to one sector of Jewry, that memory, that historical memory, has been adopted by the entire Jewish people. And it's even been ritualized, at least in Israel, very, very clearly, by the entire Jewish people. Arabs don't necessarily stop. I have seen cases where Arabs are kind of walking quietly but respectfully, trying not to interfere. I've also seen cases of Arabs walking less respectfully at that moment. But Jews, all the Jews observe this, including Jews whose families were not actually affected by this. The same thing happens with the Exodus, is what I think happened. What happened to one group of Israelites was remembered in historical memory for hundreds of years. That memory became the memory of all Jewish people, just as even today, people who convert to Judaism observe the Passover story, and they talk about Avotenu, and then they say the Amidah prayer and talk about Avotenu. They talk about our ancestors, because those people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, in the Amidah, or the generation of the Exodus, they have become, by adoption, the ancestors of somebody who converts to Judaism. The same thing happens in ancient times. What may have been a specifically Levite event is nationalized and is remembered as an all-Israelite event. As I say, more recently, a scholar named Richard Elliott Friedman wrote a book. It's on that bibliography that you can get that I've already prepared. And he describes this theory in great detail. He gives a lot of additional evidence on behalf of this Levitical theory. He actually doesn't mention Theophile Meek, which I thought was a little bit of a problem in his book, because it really is Meek who initially put this theory forward. I think that what we've seen, to sum up, and maybe we can just go a minute or two, if you've got time, Matt, we can go just to see if there are any more questions. But if I can sum up what I've said so far, I think that it's overwhelmingly likely that there were descendants of the ancient Israelites who were enslaved in Egypt in the late Bronze Age, specifically when they were first enslaved. When it first happened, we may not know, but they were slaves during the time of Ramses II. I think we can say that with great confidence. And at some time around then, maybe at the end of his reign, maybe during the reign of his son Merneptah, maybe even during the reign of Ramses III, who followed Merneptah, sometime around then, they were liberated from slavery, surprisingly. Whether you believe they were liberated from slavery by God or by good luck and coincidence, one way or the other, whether you're a religious person or not, just speaking as a historian, I think it's overwhelmingly likely that they were enslaved, they were liberated from slavery. Probably this group, included Levites. It may have only included Levites. And then the memory of this extraordinary event became the main element around which Israelite identity developed. And they shared that memory with other Israelites back in the land of Canaan. And all Israelites remembered this as something that shaped their culture, as indeed we continue to remember that down to the present day. If you want to be sort of a hyper-literalist, if you want to be a fundamentalist, the news from my lecture is not great. I don't think that we can say that all the elements of the book of Exodus are historically accurate. Clearly not all the elements are accurate. But if we're interested in the broad sweep of the narrative, the idea that our ancestors include people who were enslaved in Egypt to the Egyptian, the strongest empire of its time, and they were surprisingly set free at about the time that Moses is supposed to have lived, the end of the late Bronze Age. There are no reasons to doubt this story. People who claim there are reasons to doubt the story are simply unaware of the evidence. And even more importantly, they're unaware of what the evidence is capable of showing and not showing. Moreover, there are strong historical archaeological reasons to think that this story comes from late Bronze Age Egypt and was preserved somehow, whether in writing or orally, for many, many centuries. And then the story evolves, the story is embellished, the story is neatened up in various ways to produce the version of the story that we have in the book of Exodus. And so I think that when we recite the Shema or when we recite Kiddush on Friday night, we can say those words and we can really mean what they say. The story that we're referring to, it's not just a symbolic story, though it is that. It's not a fictional story, though it's surely an embellished story. That story is a story that refers to real historical events that happened to some ancient Israelites at the very, very dawn of the history of the Israelite nation. So I've gone a little bit over, I'm sorry about that, but maybe we can stay just for a couple more questions, Matt, before we break up for the evening.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and I think what you said was beautiful. And there's many questions you've answered throughout your talk, but one question that's come up numerous times, and you hit on it in what you just spoke, is that what is the sort of the importance of the Exodus and sort of the slave narrative, maybe for that time and also for today, if you have any insight you want to pass along.
I think, first of all, for that time, it's a very surprising story. A story in which people proudly remember the humiliation that they were once slaves. That's really quite unusual for the ancient world. Think about the origin story of Rome, the story of Aeneas. They don't say, we're descended from, a bunch of stragglers or a bunch of slaves or a bunch of this or that. They claim that their ancestor was a nobleman from one of the great empires of the ancient world. By the time Virgil's writing the Aeneas, the time of the Trojan War, that was literally already ancient history for them. One of the princes of this great kingdom of Troy that was destroyed became a refugee, and he came to Rome and founded Rome. It's much more normal that you remember you make up an impressive ancestor. For the ancient world to say, no, actually, we're descended from slaves. And we don't even belong to this country. We came in from somewhere else. That's a very, very unusual story. It may not seem that way to us, but that's because this story has taken the world by storm, not only through Judaism, but even more so through the means of Christianity and Islam. So that now I think there's a much greater recognition that, maybe we can look back at our past and tell things that aren't so impressive. But in the ancient world, this was really quite radical. And I think that for us today, the idea that there is a force in the universe that is a force for justice, that is a force for compassion, and that is a force that works through human actors slowly, perhaps frustratingly slowly, but does work and does ultimately succeed. And we can call that force God. I think that story is no less important for the contemporary world, not one bit less important for the contemporary world than it was for the ancient world. And for me personally, I think it really matters to me to discover that it's not just a symbolic story. It's not just a fable. It's not a noble fiction. It really is based on events that happened in the late Bronze Age. I think it's really quite extraordinary that as late as, the 21st century CE, we are still commemorating this not only on Passover in a special ritual meal that we all have on Passover, but we commemorate it every single week via Shabbat. We commemorate it twice every day when we recite the Shema. This incredible linkage of this incredible continuity with an event that happened in the late Bronze Age, it really is extraordinary. The fact that we've kept this memory alive and active and meaningful and productive, since we keep on imitating it by being liberated again and again, and our Christian neighbors imitate it. Our African-American neighbors are very aware of the fact that they're living through a version of this story as well. The fact that so long later we're still living the story, I think is really quite extraordinary and quite meaningful.
Thank you. I think that's a beautiful and perfect note to end our evening on. So thank you. This is a very fascinating, and I'm sure everyone out there learned a great deal from you this evening. So we all appreciate it very much.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. And as I said before, I've been at the Haberman Institute before. I've been at Binet Israel before. I've read books and articles by Reuven Hammer before, although I never had the privilege of knowing him. And so, although I do this stuff all the time, this is a particularly special event for me. It's just nice to be back at the Haberman Institute at Binet Israel, and especially be doing something in memory of Rav Reuven Hammer, Professor Reuven Hammer. It's a really great opportunity. Thank you very much.
Yes, yeah, thank you. And for all of you out there, we look forward to seeing you again at one of our upcoming programs. We have 2 more next week, as Sandy said at the beginning. So have a good night, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Good evening. Bye-bye.
Bye.